History remembers Alexander III of Macedon as a god among men, a tactical genius who, in just 13 years, dismantled the world's greatest power and forged an empire that stretched from Greece to the Himalayas. But behind the marble statues and golden myths lies a darker legacy, a story not just of conquest, but of systematic terror, calculated brutality, and a mind increasingly consumed by its own perceived divinity. It began in Pella, 356 BCE. Born to King Philip II and Queen Olympias, Alexander was raised on a diet of Homeric epics and the ruthless, often lethal politics of the Macedonian court. His education was overseen by the philosopher Aristotle, who instilled in him a love for Greek culture and a belief that he was destined for a greatness that transcended the limitations of ordinary humanity. Before his war began, Alexander visited the ruins of Troy. He saw himself as a second Achilles, destined to reenact the epic struggle between East and West, carrying a shield he believed was from the Trojan War itself. At 18, he proved his worth at the Battle of Chaeronea. Leading the elite companion cavalry, he delivered the decisive blow that broke the Greek resistance and unified the city-states under his father's banner. In 336 BCE, a single dagger changed everything. King Philip was assassinated during a wedding festival, and the 20-year-old Alexander ascended a throne surrounded by enemies. When Thebes rose in rebellion, Alexander didn't just march to meet them, he flew. He covered 240 miles in just 14 days, appearing at their gates before the rumor of his arrival had even spread. 6,000 Thebans were slaughtered. 30,000 survivors, men, women, and children, were sold into slavery. The city was razed to the ground, leaving only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. With Greece pacified by terror, Alexander turned his gaze east. In 334 BCE, he crossed into Asia, beginning a campaign that would change the map of the world and the course of history forever. At the river Granicus, the legend nearly ended before it began. A Persian noble's axe was inches from Alexander's head when his general, Cleitus the Black, intervened, severing the attacker's arm in a moment of desperate loyalty. After Granicus, Alexander chose a risky strategy. He disbanded his own navy, deciding to defeat the Persian fleet from the land by capturing every port in the Mediterranean, beginning with the siege of Miletus. The campaign then hit a wall at Halicarnassus. Defended by the brilliant Greek mercenary Memnon, the city required a grueling siege. Alexander's engineers filled moats 45 feet wide just to reach the walls. In Phrygia, he encountered the Gordian knot. Legend said whoever untied it would rule Asia. Eschewing patience for power, Alexander simply drew his sword and sliced through the problem. At the Battle of Issus, tact overcomes numbers. Darius III had cornered Alexander in a narrow pass, but the Macedonian king turned the trap into a triumph, charging directly at the heart of the Persian line. Darius fled the field in panic, leaving his family, his treasury, and his dignity behind. Alexander was now the master of Asia Minor, but his thirst for conquest was only growing. The island fortress of Tyre believed it was impregnable. They denied Alexander entry to their temple, a slight he took with deadly seriousness. If they would not open their gates, he would build a path to them. His engineers moved millions of tons of stone and timber, constructing a massive mole through the sea. It was a feat of engineering that permanently altered the geography of the Lebanese coast. The Tyrians fought with desperate ingenuity, using fire ships to incinerate Alexander's siege towers. But the conqueror simply widened the bridge and brought in a massive navy to finish the job. After 7 months, the walls crumbled. The slaughter was absolute. 8,000 Tyrians died in the streets. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The defiance of Tyre was answered with a bloodbath. To ensure the world understood the price of resistance, Alexander ordered 2,000 men of military age to be crucified along the shore. The island city was gone, replaced by a permanent peninsula of death. In Egypt, he was welcomed as a liberator. The Persians were gone, and Alexander was crowned pharaoh. He founded Alexandria, the first of over 70 cities that would spread Greek culture across the East. He personally marked out the city's boundaries with flour, envisioning a global center of learning and trade. Alexandria would become the brightest jewel in his crown, a city built on the intersection of 3 continents. Driven by a mysterious longing, Alexander made a perilous 300-mile journey to the Oracle of Ammon in the Siwa oasis. Running out of water, legend says they were saved by a miraculous rainstorm. At the temple, the priest greeted him as the Son of God. Alexander left the oasis convinced of his own divinity, no longer just a king, but a god-king destined to rule the world. But the brutality returned at Gaza. For 2 months, the Persian governor Batis held out. During the siege, a catapult bolt punched through Alexander's shield and buried itself in his shoulder, fueling his rage. To breach the fortress, Alexander's army moved millions of tons of sand, building ramps that dwarfed the city walls. When the city finally fell, every man was put to the sword. Alexander's fury at Batis was personal. Imitating his ancestor Achilles, he had bronze rings forced through the governor's ankles and dragged him alive behind his chariot until the city walls claimed his life. The final confrontation with Darius occurred at Gaugamela. The Persian king had assembled a host so vast that Alexander's generals urged him to attack under the cover of night. He refused to steal his victory. With a flawless diagonal charge, Alexander carved a path directly to Darius. Once again, the King of Kings fled, and the Achaemenid Empire, the greatest in history, effectively collapsed. He entered Babylon and Susa as the undisputed king of Asia. The wealth of the world was now in his hands, 120,000 talents of silver from Susa alone. But his ambition remained insatiable. At the Persian gates, he faced a Thermopylae in reverse. The satrap Ariobarzanes ambushed the Macedonians with boulders in a pass only a few meters wide, forcing a rare Macedonian retreat. Using a local guide, Alexander led a daring night march through the mountains to flank the Persians. At dawn, he struck from behind, annihilating the defenders and clearing the path to Persepolis. He reached Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persia. But the city's fate would not be one of preservation. During a night of drunken revelry, the glory of the empire would be turned to ash. Urged on by the Athenian courtesan Thais, who sought revenge for the Persian burning of her home, Alexander set the palace of Xerxes ablaze. A single spark reduced the ancient glory of Persia to rubble. The fire was not an accident, but a political statement. The Macedonian conqueror had arrived, and the old world was being consumed to make way for the new. The palace burned for days. The pursuit of Darius became a race, but Alexander would not capture the king alive. Darius was deposed and stabbed by his own satrap, Bessus, and left to die in a wagon in the desert. Alexander pursued the usurper Bessus across the Hindu Kush. To avenge the royal house, he ordered Bessus mutilated, his nose and ears cut off in the Persian fashion, before sending him to his execution. As he moved deeper into Asia, Alexander began to change. He adopted Persian court dress and demanded proskynesis, the ritual bowing that his Macedonian officers found offensive and repulsive. The enlightened conqueror was becoming an Oriental despot. Paranoia led to the execution of his most trusted generals, including the old guard leader Parmenion, as the inner circle began to fracture. By 328 BCE, the tension exploded. At a feast in Samarkand, Cleitus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life, dared to speak the truth. He reminded the king that his throne was bought with Macedonian blood. In a flash of blind, drunken rage, Alexander ran his friend through with a spear. Cleitus fell dead, and the silence that followed was the heaviest of Alexander's life. The savior was now the victim. He fell into a deep, suicidal depression, realizing he had become the very barbarian he claimed to civilize. But his ambition was the only thing stronger than his regret. He pushed even further. He pushed his army over the frozen peaks of the Hindu Kush into the unknown lands of India. His men, exhausted and weary of a war that had no end, followed him only out of a mixture of love and terror. At the Hydaspes River, he met King Porus. It would be Alexander's most costly victory. The Indian king deployed a wall of 200 war elephants, a sight that terrified the Macedonian horses. In the middle of a monsoon storm, Alexander orchestrated a daring night crossing, tricking Porus and flanking his army. The battle that followed was a literal bloodbath in the mud. The elephants were eventually driven back onto their own troops, trampling friend and foe alike. Alexander was so impressed by Porus's bravery that he reinstated him as a ruler of his own lands. At the Hyphasis River, Alexander begged his men to go further, promising them the riches of the Ganges. But the dream of one man could no longer sustain the exhaustion of thousands. They had reached the edge of the world. For the first time, the invincible king was defeated, not by an enemy army, but by the will of his own men. The mutiny forced him to turn back, marking the beginning of the end for his campaign. The return was a disaster. Alexander led his army through the Gadrosian desert, reportedly to outdo previous conquerors who had failed the crossing. It was his greatest strategic failure. When a soldier brought him the last of their water in a helmet, Alexander poured it onto the sand, refusing to drink if his men could not, a gesture of leadership in a march that was killing them all. Heat, thirst, and flash floods decimated the force. Up to 3/4 of his army and thousands of followers perished in the sand. The once invincible force returned to Susa as a ghost of itself. In a final attempt to unify his crumbling empire, he organized the Susa weddings, forcing his officers to marry Persian royalty. It was a union of blood and power, an attempt to breed a new master race. The death of his closest companion, Hephaestion, broke his spirit. In a final, desperate act of grief, Alexander ordered the total slaughter of the Caucaean tribe as a funeral offering to his friend's ghost. Hephaestion's death left a vacuum in Alexander's heart that even the conquest of the world could not fill. The king began to speak of himself in the third person, as if he were already a legend. In June 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon. After a night of heavy drinking, a fever took hold. For 12 days, he lay bedridden in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, his empire hanging by a thread. When asked to whom he left his empire, his final words were reportedly, "To the strongest." At the age of 32, the man who wanted to be a god was dead, leaving a world in chaos. The empire didn't outlive him. His generals, the Diadochi, immediately began to tear it apart. Decades of civil war followed, fueled by the same ambition that had built the empire in the first place. At the Battle of Ipsus, the largest concentration of war elephants in history fought over the pieces of Alexander's dream. The hope of a unified empire died on that field. By 281 BCE, the world stabilized into 3 main Hellenistic kingdoms. These states would preserve and spread Greek culture across the East for centuries to come. His greatest legacy was not the empire of land, but the empire of the mind. He brought Greek language, science, and administration to the East, creating a cultural fusion that would later influence Rome. This fusion of East and West created a new world. Greek gymnasiums stood beside Persian temples, and a common language linked the Adriatic to the Indus, setting the stage for the Roman world. Alexander founded over 70 cities, most named after himself. These became the cultural nodes of the Hellenistic world, lasting long after the Macedonian spears had rusted to dust. Alexander built an empire of legend, but its foundations were soaked in the blood of his enemies and his friends. Was he a bringer of light to the East, or a shadow of terror that consumed everything it touched? Greatness, it seems, often demands a price that history is still trying to calculate. We are still living in the wake of the world he broke and rebuilt in his own image. His name echoes through the millennia, a reminder that the line between a hero and a tyrant is often written in the blood of those who stood in the way. In the end, even the strongest must face the silence. Alexander the Great, forever a legend, forever a shadow,